Mr. Speaker, I only wish to speak very briefly in support of this bill, and I want to touch on a couple of points. But firstly, I just want to make the observation that it's a shame to see, and even in a relatively benign tax bill like this, that Andrew Williams sought to go down that muckraking path, talking about cabinet clubs and the like. You'd think after the news media coverage on Sunday night on TV1 and TV3, they would have got the message that the nasty and the muckraking isn't going to help them, but in the race to 20%, they can keep doing what they want if they want. Mr. Speaker, I just want to touch briefly on two parts of this bill. Firstly, the accommodation for employee accommodation rules that are being changed in this particular bill. We did hear some submissions around boarding schools and the way in which they should treat student accommodation. I just want to put on record the fact that the Select Committee did consider those matters in quite a bit of detail. The question was around, if you've got a boarding school that has a matron's flat of, say, 60 square metres sitting underneath the boarding house with lots of boys running around in the middle of the night in the boarding house, is that 50 square metre matron's flat worth the same amount of money as a 50 square metre piece of property down the road? And the answer probably is no. And so the boarding schools had some issues around how they should value that piece of property within their boarding school. The committee did consider a range of options that the boarding schools wanted, including at one end of the spectrum a full exemption from having to pay tax on that accommodation. Ultimately, though, the committee came down to the point of view where that IRD could issue some very detailed and helpful operational guidance to those taxpayers, and we think that will be a method by which those boarding schools and any other taxpayers in a similar situation will have some good guidance to allow them to properly assess the value of that property. The second point I just want to make briefly also is around the FATCA legislation in the United States. The Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act in the United States is one that is very complex and has led to a lot of concern from New Zealanders who also happen to be US residents for tax purposes. And so, Mr. Speaker, the committee did give a lot of consideration to this issue as well. Ultimately, though, that legislation is legislation in the United States. There is a requirement for those within New Zealand to comply with their tax obligations in the United States. If we were to do nothing as a country, the risk would be that institutions that have operations in the United States would be subject to a 30% withholding tax if there weren't appropriate agreements put in place between New Zealand and the United States. And so the committee came to the point of view that it was appropriate that we enable the financial institutions within New Zealand to have agreements in place that will enable them to transmit the data required by the United States. People will consent to that data being transferred by way of agreements with their own financial institution, but the risk to New Zealand taxpayers of doing nothing is very high, and that's why the committee couldn't completely ignore the issue. So, Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House. There are some good pieces of legislative change in this bill that will be helpful for New Zealanders.
A point of order, Richard Prosser.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't want to interrupt the previous member in the full flow of his speech, but at the beginning he made reference to Andrew Williams, and I wonder if he might like to correct that, because I think Mr. Williams spoke in support of the bill and wasn't muckraking. He may well have got his Andrews mixed up.
That's actually a debating point. It's not something you do with a point of order. If the member misheard or misunderstood, it's not an occasion for a point of order. Now that this is a split call, Darian Fenton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to take a call in the second reading of the Taxation Annual Rates Employee